The Velocity Controller Editor can be opened by clicking on the icon at the bottom or the top. It can also be accessed from the View menu, plus there is a shortcut Alt+V. You can have up to 4 controller lanes visible at the same time. The default view is usually just the Velocity Editor lane, although there are 3 more lane reveal buttons below. If you can't see them all, place the mouse cursor at the top of the Velocity Controller Editor just below the scroll bar. When the mouse cursor turns into a double-headed vertical arrow, left-click and drag upwards to resize the editor. To view the other 3 controller lanes, left-click on the lane reveal buttons so they turn blue. To change the controller type for individual lanes, left-click on the small downward arrow and select from the list. I'm going to start with the Velocity Editor, so I'm hiding the other lanes. In this editor, velocity is represented by a series of vertical bars. These can be edited using the Combi selection tool, the Freehand drawing tool, or the line drawing tool. More about them later. When no MIDI notes are selected, all velocity values are displayed in the velocity lane and will be blue. You can choose to display velocity for individual note pitches. Click on the piano roll note relating to that pitch. When I select a note pitch using the virtual piano, that selection is indicated by the key turning red. This activates a kind of filter for this pitch. A red horizontal selection guide also appears in the matrix to the right. Notice in the velocity lane, only the selected pitch is now displayed. All other pitches have been filtered from view. You can add additional note pitches to that selection by Ctrl+F-clicking on the desired keys. These will now also be displayed in the Velocity Editor. To make a contiguous selection, left-click on the first note and Shift-left-click on the last note. These selected note pitches can now be viewed in the controller lane. Take note that double-clicking on a key will also select the notes of that key in the matrix editor. Notice that the velocity bars in the controller editor have also turned red. Use the control modifier plus a double click to add filtered selected notes to the controller lane. The filtered selection will then be ready for editing. Control left clicking on a selected key will deselect that pitch, so it's no longer displayed in the velocity lane. Control double-clicking on a filtered key removes it from the velocity lane and deselects the notes in the matrix editor. To deselect all notes, do the following. Click once on any of the highlighted keys and click once in an empty space in the matrix editor. When everything is deselected, the Velocity Controller Editor will again display all notes relating to that object. You can also display individual note pitches so they are contrasted in the Velocity Editor. To do this, double-click in an empty space between the MIDI notes for the desired pitch. The notes will turn red and the velocity display for those notes will also turn red. You can also add to the selections using the Control modifier. You can now adjust the velocity for those selected notes. A note of warning: if you have unwittingly clicked a piano note which has no related MIDI notes, this will still act as a filter and hide all other notes, a scenario which can easily catch you out, especially in the heat of the moment. So if you find you have no velocity bars displayed in the controller lane, double check to make sure there are no errant empty pitches selected. There are 3 tools for manipulating data in the Velocity Controller Editor. The top tool is the Combi tool selection tool, below that is the Freehand drawing tool, and below that is the line drawing tool. Beginning with the Combi selection tool, at its most basic you can edit a single velocity value. Place the mouse cursor at the top of a vertical bar. It then turns to a vertical double-headed arrow. Left-click and drag to adjust the level. To adjust more than one, do the following. Left-click in an empty area and drag a rectangle around the velocity bars you want to select. Place the mouse cursor at the top of one of the bars and drag up or down. All selected velocities will follow suit. You can multi-select groups of velocity bars by using the Control modifier when selecting. Lasso select the individual velocities you want to adjust. Then again, grab the top of one of them to adjust all of the selected velocities. To deselect all, just left-click in an empty space. To match unequal velocity levels, do the following. First, lasso select the notes in either the velocity editor or the matrix editor. Then place the mouse cursor at the top of the velocity bar you want all others to match. When the double-headed arrow appears, left-click and hold, and then add the Shift modifier. Make a very slight up or down adjustment, and all the other velocity levels will jump to match the selected one. Incidentally, you can do a similar thing in the matrix editor using the velocity tool. Grab the velocity tool, place it over the note you want the others to conform to. Now make a slight adjustment while holding down Shift, and all selected notes will jump to that value. When adjusting multiple offset velocity levels in the velocity lane, these relative offsets are always retained. Although if you continue dragging the vertical velocity bars upwards, as soon as the tallest velocity bar reaches 127, the lower velocities will begin to catch up. If you then release the mouse, and then grab and drag again, all offsets will be lost. But providing you haven't let go of the mouse, the velocity offsets will be retained. The same rule applies when lowering velocities. Below the Combi selection tool is the Freehand drawing tool. Left-click and drag to draw in your curves freehand. Modulation is mapped to the cutoff control in Massive. To delete these freehand events, grab the Combi selection tool, then drag to select the events and press Delete. Another way to delete freehand curves is to do it from the MIDI event list. Open the MIDI event list, select a modulation event and enable the filter button. Next, press Ctrl+A to select all and hit Delete. When using freehand drawing mode, pressing the Shift modifier will switch to line drawing mode. The third tool is the dedicated line drawing tool. This is ideally suited for drawing in controller ramps. Left-click and drag to execute. You can adjust events by using the Combi selection tool. Make a selection and adjust to taste. As usual, you can use the Control modifier to select multiple areas and adjust those in parallel. When using selection mode, press the Shift modifier to switch to line drawing mode. You can also thin out controller events. The thinning out command uses the active quantize setting. Select the data you want to thin out and then choose the quantize setting. Go to the menu item MIDI Functions Quantize Thin Out Controller. The selected events will now be quantized to that setting. You can then adjust those individually quantized blocks. If no selection is made, the events will be quantized for the entire object length. Take note that when you quantize events in this way, you can progressively quantize them to a finer quantized setting, but the reverse is not possible. Once the events have been quantized to, for example, 1/8 notes, you can't quantize them back to 1/16, although you will be able to quantize them forward to 1/4. That's because the command is effectively a thinning out command. You may find that using a combination of the controller editor and the event list editor works best, especially when dealing with pitch bend or modulation. Using the event editor will give you a better overview in some situations. As an example, select a pitch bend event and then enable the filter in the MIDI event editor. Make your selection. You can now make adjustments in the event editor using the numerical values as a guide. Use the up and down arrows in the event editor to select next or previous events. The same applies with modulation. Turn off the event filter and select a modulation event. Then turn the filter back on. You can now adjust the modulation values. So using the MIDI event list along with the controller editor lanes gives you a great deal of flexibility.